So hello and welcome back to the Exist Better YouTube channel. My camera is up higher today, so hopefully it's not too awkward. I won't really be looking in it like constantly. But I wanted to talk about this concept that is all over the internet in these sort of men's self-development circles, I guess you could call them. And that's just this concept being pushed that basically there are alpha males and they are the good ones and the right ones, and then there's beta males, and I think there's other types as well, but I don't know any of them. And then the beta males are the ones you don't want to be, and that's sort of the dichotomy, and everything's about becoming more of this and less of that, right? That's sort of the whole strategy. So in this video, I want to talk about basically the blind spots of that ideology and that mode of operating, and what are the implications of operating from that understanding of yourself and the world. So what are the implications? What does this create, first of all, for men who don't identify, who don't feel like they are naturally the alpha ones, and so what becomes of them? Like what do they make of this? And then the impacts on women as well, because a lot of times these teachings are geared toward straight men who are trying to attract women, and they're having a hard time with relationships. Something's not working for them, and so this is presented by a lot of these male leaders as a strategy for basically acquiring women, or at least one woman. So we're going to talk about what happens from each person's perspective, the men, the women, etc. If you hear noises, it's my dog snoring in the background. Oh, jeez. Okay, so just get on with it, right? Okay, so I want to start with this basic explanation of what it means to live from a strategy and how it is very mechanical. So if you are living in an attempt to be alpha, let's say you're a man who's, trying to do self-improvement stuff. I know a lot of guys kind of like fall into this and end up learning about this. And so you start thinking through this lens. So you start living not authentically from who you are, not even from your own conditioning or like patterns that you're in, habits that you're in. You've replaced all that with a strategy, right? So again, like we said, this has nothing to do with authenticity. This has nothing to do with developing self-worth and self-esteem. A strategy can't give you any of that. The only thing a strategy can give you is confidence that you do if you do the strategy well, right? So it can give you confidence as long as you keep living by that strategy, but it can't give you things like meaning, self-knowledge, self-worth, self-esteem. It can't help you to assess compatibility with another person. It really is just saying, if I input X, I get Y as a result, right? If I check all the boxes, I don't know if you guys have seen, what is it? It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with the dentist, and he has his system where he has a strategy for, and that's like the extreme example of male dysfunction in this sense, I guess you can say. So long story short, when you're living from a strategy, you're basically trying to use that, and people don't know that they're doing this. I think a lot of people who teach this alpha beta thing in an unhealthy way, I don't know if there necessarily is a healthy way. Perhaps there is. I definitely think there's more and less healthy ways. But if you're teaching this in the unhealthy way, what people don't know, their blind spot, what they don't know they're doing, is they're looking for a replacement for intuition development and feminine development. So the reason I know this is because I've been a girl my whole life. So when I've encountered, I've noticed particularly that there's two types of men that I would interact with. Like when I was younger and I was single, there would be the ones who would approach me like I was a chemistry experiment. And I would always say, like, I would always think in my head, like, I'm not a lab experiment, what's going on here? Because they would approach me with a strategy. And at the time, you know, like feminist thinking, like you just get offended, right? So I would just get offended and like brush them off and be like, get out of here. I don't know what you're doing. You're doing some weird scheme. You've got some sort of system you're doing here, right? So it's like, get out of here. I don't know. That's weird. I don't know what that's about. At the time, I didn't understand why they felt a need to have a system. Now I understand. So the other type of men that I would encounter would be the ones who would just be a person, and those were always the ones I would end up dating because they were just people, you know? So you would either connect to them or you wouldn't, but either way, they'd either become a friend or like a romantic interest because they would just approach you and speak to you like a person and get to know you. Very common sense stuff, right? So that is so I guess let's just go here now since I started with that. So from the perspective of a straight, let's say you're a straight single female and you're looking to meet a nice guy, when someone approaches you with a strategy and you're not an idiot, what you will experience is a red flag, like an alert, like bad guy, bad guy, bad guy. Because you can feel that something's off. And I'm going to tell you first what it is that's off when someone is applying a strategy to connect with you. It's that they have so little intuitive and feminine development that they have no understanding of how to connect with an actual woman, because there's such a big gap between most women and these guys. So they need a strategy to try to make up for the fact that they are so emotionally and intuitively underdeveloped. So the only way they know how to do that is to create a replacement with logic, because they're usually really good with logic. And so for the average female who's maybe has like a good radar, maybe they're not acting from like a traumatic pattern or something, they're going to be like, no way. Right away, they're going to be like, no, this is some sort of weird thing. And they're going to feel unsafe because, and that sense of unsafety, like I was saying, most feminists get really offended when people hit on them in this strategic way, and they feel they're offended because they're just reacting. But what's actually happening is they feel this core sense of unsafety, emotional unsafety, and maybe even further unsafety. But they feel unsafe because the person who's strategizing can't actually connect or understand them. So basically, long story short, we're just dealing with a population of men who cannot understand or empathize. What would it be like for me to be emotional and live according to emotion and intuition and all this like vague stuff? They have no idea. So they literally cannot connect with a woman, and thus could not empathize with her, could not protect her, could not give her anything she needs, really. It's kind of just like bad all around for the female, if the female is developed enough to see that that's what's going on. So again, a woman who's less developed, she's going to fall for the strategy hook, line, and sinker. A woman with low self-esteem, going to fall for the strategy. She's going to fall for the dentist system, hook, line, and sinker, because she's kind of on that level where she sort of matches that predatorial type of thing. And I'm not even saying predatorial in the sense that I think there are a lot of like nice, like well-meaning men who do this even. Like I don't even think it's necessarily just these like crazy like sociopathic predator. Like this is a widespread problem, and I've been, like I said, in the past when I was younger, I've been approached by men in this way, and they clearly don't understand what they're doing. They don't understand that they're trying to replace their own development with a strategy for getting close to a woman, because it's really those feminine qualities that they're craving and lacking. That's why they want a woman in the first place, right? So that's the first thing. From the feminine perspective, a developed female will experience these strategy guys as unsafe because they can't empathize. They don't know what it's like to be developed in any sort of feminine capacity, right? It makes me think of that like Ryan Gosling meme where girls are always like, he's the perfect guy because it's really, really basic. He's just able to like empathize and understand you on a very basic level. And it's kind of sad because that's really not that big of a deal. Like there is a talent pool for this. Like there's a lot of women out there who are just like, oh, the guys are crazy. They're all like these strategists who are just trying to get something out of you and use you. That's not true. Like that's just not true. There's a bunch of them, but then there's also a bunch of men who are just naturally more femininely developed. They're just more in balance in that way. And so there's a whole talent pool to choose from. Like if you're one of these women who's like, all the men are like super whatever, like these bad guys, they're not. There's plenty of men in the category of they're emotionally developed enough that they can empathize with you and see you as a person that they could relate to. It's not like a unicorn thing. There's plenty of guys like this. So that's kind of the downsides as I see them. Living according to I'm trying to be an alpha means you're not living in authenticity. You're not developing yourself in any true way. You're only developing yourself mentally by a set of rules you have to follow. Strategy is not a replacement for intuition. Strategy is not a replacement for assessing real compatibility with another person. So I always find it strange that these guys also seem to enter, a lot of them seem to have this perspective that they just want any female, like anyone that they could catch, like a wild animal or something. And they're not even remotely concerned with compatibility. This is another part of their like lack of emotional development, I think, is that they don't even understand. They haven't even like thought that far into the idea that like some women are compatible for them and some women are not, and that all women are different and have different like a completely different internal world in some ways. And so part of assessing that compatibility is there has to be self-knowledge and connection to oneself to be able to do that. So to a lot of you that might sound very obvious, but to these guys, I think it can be kind of a foreign concept sometimes. So this is already really long. This is going to be a long one, guys. I can't help it this time. There's just like so many things to say. So part 2, I'm going to talk about for people who don't identify as naturally an alpha type of person. If you don't really know what I'm talking about, just look up masculine characteristics versus feminine characteristics. Like, what are the tendencies? So if you don't identify as one of these alpha folks, you're automatically put into the category of wrong, not the right kind, right? You're not the right kind. So you got to do something to change yourself, which obviously right off the bat, we have a problem there because we have a contradiction, because these men are teaching self-development and self-respect, it seems, where it's all about confidence and self-respect and self-efficacy, the ability to go out and do things and be a success in whatever area you want to be successful. And then we have this weird contradiction of like, oh yeah, and if you're doing any of these things, you're a big fat piece of shit and you need to stop right away because you're worthless, right? But just follow this strategy and suddenly you will have worth. And so it's a huge contradiction because you can't start there and get there. It's not a thing. It's not how emotional and mental health works. So you can't start in this place of shame, which is I'm inherently defective, follow a strategy, end up in a place of I am inherently valuable. It's not a thing, you know. You start where you are, and you give yourself the benefit of the doubt. This is how it actually works. You give yourself the benefit of the doubt that you are already valuable and worth something, and that the way you are is either perfectly acceptable as it is and okay, and that's just self-acceptance, or how you are is some sort of a habit or adaptation or trauma response that has kind of sent you off the rails, like a behavioral some sort of like coping mechanism or something you're doing that's problematic that you can't seem to stop doing. And it's probably rooted in some sort of neurological patterning, right? Something that happened to you in the past that caused you to feel like you now have to do these things, or you now have to accept less than what you deserve. And these patterns and these, so let's just talk about some typical issues that someone might have if they, let's say, don't identify with these alpha characteristics. So right off the bat, they're not going to feel confident in relationships with women. They're not going to feel able to probably attract the type of person that they would actually want to be with. They probably have some boundary issues. I've almost never met a man, personally, myself, who was having like emotional issues of some kind and didn't also simultaneously have issues with boundaries. Setting them, respecting them, sometimes both. So boundary issues are probably going to be a thing. So when you see dysfunction in men, and not like this alpha variety of like living by this fake strategy of, how do I like trick people into getting what I want from them and get lots of money and fast cars and all that. Like this very caveman approach, not that. That we just talked about. When you see other types of dysfunction in men, emotional issues, boundary issues, self-worth issues, letting themselves get used. There's this big term in that world, the alpha beta world. They call them like orbiters, basically men who like orbit women and they never get dates, but they just keep like hanging around and like messaging them and calling them, and obviously the person doesn't care. They're just kind of using them for something. Like these men who just get used and they have low self-esteem and they can't get anywhere in their careers, maybe they're low paid and yada yada yada. That sort of dysfunction that you see happening, it's not a result of being more emotionally and intuitively developed. So people, like, there's confusion. It's not that. It's that when you are more emotionally and intuitively developed and you have a lot of trauma and you're living in a world where the way that you are is considered deemed unacceptable, because there's only one type of male that is acceptable, supposedly, you basically have a bunch of layers on top of each other, right? There's your core nature, which is probably a little more on the feminine side than these other guys over here. Then you've got your trauma, which has caused you to have to adapt in all these unhealthy ways. And then you've got the cultural constructs and biases that are warping your mind, literally programming your mind to hate yourself, right? So this is what these beta guys, or any guy who doesn't identify with the alpha shit, this is what they're usually up against. It's a couple layers of things, right? So when we're talking about healing that guy, those types of issues, the information that's coming in from these alpha people is basically further invalidating him and further telling him that there's something innately defective in him. So it's piling on the layers of shame rather than, and so when you see these beta guys and they start to try to follow the alpha advice, it can actually be like scary, dangerous. Like when you have people who are super unhealthy emotionally, and they're men, and you see these like school shooters and these like rapists and stuff, and what do you think, these alpha guys, they don't get anything. What do you think is going on there? It's we've taken these men who are extremely not okay mentally and emotionally, and we've told them, you're powerful, you're strong, you can take back your power, stop taking shit, and like you make them your bitch instead of it being the other way around, right? And then you have people go and shoot up schools and rape people, and we wonder like what's going on here. And people will say, oh, they were just so beta. That's what it was. No, it wasn't. It's that we have no idea how to handle these types of people other than to try to shame them out of who they are and where they are, right? And I'm not condoning like insane like violence or anything. I think most people in that category, even though they are having problems, they're still in control of themselves enough to not go and do something like that, usually. But I do want to address, when taken to the extreme, I do think that's what happens when these people try to take back their power or whatever they're calling it. And to be honest with you, I can't help but be reminded of, like what's going on in the world, and these tyrannical people starting wars and killing families and children and things. How do you think, how does someone, and I talked about this in the Why We Choose War video that I made a couple weeks back, but how do you think it becomes possible for a man of such dysfunction to come into power and literally convince and brainwash thousands and thousands and thousands of other men to go in and do his biddings? Basically, tyrants and their soldiers. Where do you think they come from? I think they were probably having some of these beta guy issues, and they decided that they were going to become the alphas. I'm not saying that everyone who teaches men to be masculine, they're perpetuating like war or something. I think there's totally such a thing as, you're a guy who has become out of touch with your masculinity and you need to get back in touch with it, and you need a teacher to help you do that. Like, that's great. That's totally a thing, and I'm all about that. But when you look at the people doing the teaching, it's very clear that sometimes they're not well themselves. They're not balanced themselves. So it's really, you have to assess these people on a case-by-case basis. And unfortunately, when people are, down on their luck, they're not really usually great at doing that. They're more like, I'll take anybody's advice. Anybody who seems certain and assertive and sure of themselves tend to acquire a lot of followers, even if they're a Hitler type, right? And like I said, I've talked about this in the war video. So it's one thing to develop assertiveness, confidence, a go-getter attitude, to be powerful, to be strong, to be logical, to be all these wonderful masculine things, to have strong boundaries. It's a whole other thing to refuse the development of emotion and intuition. And I know I come back to this in a lot of videos, but that's purposeful because I believe that the most destructive force on the planet that currently exists, there's lots of things we can say are destructive forces, but I think the most destructive one that exists is these tyrant men and their sheer, complete and total unwillingness to develop any amount of their feminine selves. Because as soon as they did that, they wouldn't be able to do anything that they do. Someone's always going to find a way to take this the wrong way. I'm not against men's development. I'm not against masculinity. I actually prefer when other people are masculine, because God knows I'm not at all, so somebody needs to help me. But yeah, I mean, there's a dysfunctional way to do that, and there's a functional way to do that. As far as advice goes, for females, we need to start having boundaries and having a backbone, and stop settling for these caricatures of men, and stop circulating the idea that they're attractive, because they're not, and they never will be. And they never were. These caricatures of like very one-dimensional men, there's really nothing attractive about it whatsoever. So women who are perpetuating this idea that we want one-dimensional caricatures of men, you're not doing anyone any favors, including yourself, right? So really just laying down the law. It doesn't have to be in an aggressive way, but very politely, very calmly laying down the law. I will not settle for an incredibly one-dimensional person who sees me as a science experiment, because I have feelings and intuition, and that's what I live by. Plain and simple, right? Easily said, but not easily done, perhaps. But yeah, so that's a potential self-worth point for women. Is there's no need to settle for these types of men. Let these men develop into emotional and intuitive beings themselves and become compatible to you. Don't let them strategize their way in so that they can feel powerful. It's faux power anyway. So don't humor them in their strategic, delusions. So that's my 2 cents for women, is stop settling for this sort of one-dimensional caveman type of character. Stop dating them, stop marrying them, stop letting them control you and ruin your life, And if you have someone, not everyone is going to be that dysfunctional. Some men are just really not, they just don't understand feminine ways of being, and it's not through any fault of their own, and there's nothing horribly wrong with them. And so you just need to explain to them, because they may not naturally know. Some men will very naturally and intuitively understand things like feelings, and again, I'm sort of generalizing because I don't want to go into too much detail, but others, you will have to explain a little more. So don't just write people off just because they're not exactly like you. Not at all. But I'm just saying, don't settle for these unhealthy people, obviously, right? So that's that. And then advice for non-alpha men. Your self-esteem, your development, your getting what you want, your happiness, all of these things are not going to come from a strategy. You are too developed. If you watch this sort of content, self-development content, if you're more in touch with all things shadow and emotion, and you are already too developed to live the way that alpha males are telling you to live. You're already past that point where you can use what they're teaching you to be happy and successful. You're already more complex than that right out of the gate, right from the get-go. So you may take a little bit of their advice. Like maybe you do need to be more assertive and you need to like do some of the things they're saying, for sure. But overall, a lot of that strategy is just not rooted in anything that you need. It's a lot of jargon, it's a lot of ego pumping, and people patting themselves on the back for how they already are. And it's nothing special to be the way you already are and pat yourself on the back for how great you are. What's special is development, is reaching higher levels and realizing different things and trying to integrate new, that's growth, right? So there's nothing special with this guy who's completely cut off from his feelings to tell you, who are not cut off, that you just need to be more cut off, right? Like, there's nothing special about him. He's just cut off and you're not. That's just the way it is, right? So again, there may be healthy versions of this, like learning how to be more assertive, learning how not to take shit from people, don't let people walk all over you. There's plenty of good that you can pull from the alpha teachings, but you never want to base your identity on it. You never want to base very much on it. It's something that you can maybe use as a tool to come back into balance when you've been very out of balance for a very long time. And then once you feel like you've done that, you can kind of just, disengage. If the teachings bring up triggers and negative feelings, and if they leave you feeling triggered once you're done reading that stuff on Reddit or watching that stuff on YouTube, you need to disengage from it completely and never look back, because it's nothing for you. If it's nothing but a trigger about how you're not good enough, it's old news. It's already your baggage. So all it's doing is just triggering the worthlessness that you already feel, and that's the problem that you want to work on, not the fact that you're too sensitive or some bullshit, right? None of that. So that's it, I suppose, on the alpha beta topic. The next video you see is probably going to be my interview with an expert on the theory of positive disintegration. So if you don't know what that is, or you do and you're interested, you want to come check it out, you can do that. My last interview was with Jeff Finley. You can go check that out, about creativity and capitalism. Yeah, okay, that's it. Check out the website if you're interested in one-on-one shadow work sessions or anything else, really, just looking around. That's it. Bye.